Okay. So we actually had a mention of NEET in the discussion that we just had. So what is NEET? NEET youth are defined as youth who are between the ages of 15 and 24, who are not currently in employment, education, or training. And this measure of NEET has actually become more popular in recent years for governments for exactly the reasons that were talked about earlier. We have a generation of youth who are not necessarily building skills and not necessarily building career trajectories, and this can represent lost opportunities and, of course, present problems in especially aging society context. And so this is part of a larger project. I'm just giving some highlights from this project, looking at the situation for NEET youth in Thailand who are between the ages of 15 and 24, and then also trying to understand the impact of COVID on NEET youth in Thailand. Overall, the unemployment trend in Thailand looks like this. I want you to look at the solid lines there at the bottom. This is the overall unemployment rate for Thailand for 15 plus. And you'll notice that it's extremely low. In fact, COVID hit and it doubled from 1% to 2%. So we don't have very high unemployment rates in Thailand, and this has been a historical trend. I could spend an entire hour talking about why that's the case. But what's important here is that the broken lines above are different groupings of youth from 15 to 19 and then from 20 to 24. And you'll notice that those unemployment rates are higher and they're actually increasing over time. And there was certainly a jump between 2019 and 2020, particularly for young women between the ages of 15 and 19. It reached 13% in 2020. So what I wanted to do is look at the overall NEET situation in Thailand using microdata. And so I've used the Thai Labor Force Survey between the years of 2011 and 2021. This is a nationally representative labor force survey that's reported quarterly by the National Statistical Office. I use the third quarter because this is considered the full employment survey because of the agricultural calendar. The methods pretty much are just descriptive methods. I'm just going to be showing you lots of pictures today. In order to do that, though, I had to define what NEET is. So NEET is the total number of youth in the age group of 15 to 24. We subtract out the youth who are employed or in education, and then divide that by the total number of youth. This aggregate number, though, is a bit problematic because it can obscure heterogeneity among NEET youth. And so we need to look at more disaggregated figures. And so what I've done is actually separated this NEET measure into three separate measures. The unemployed, who are available for work and seeking work. The inactive and not in education, who are neither available nor looking for work. And then a third group called marginal labor market attachment, which includes those who are available for work and not seeking employment. And these are often called discouraged workers. And then also people who are looking for employment, but may not be available to work because of potentially unpaid care work in their household. I also look at a related measure that's important for the Thai context, which is unpaid family workers, particularly in agricultural settings. When we look at the broad NEET measure over time on the left-hand side, we can see that the NEET rates are much higher for women than they are for men, and they have risen over time from about 17.2% in 2011 for women to 19.4% by 2021. Actually, I think that's the 2020 number, and then from 7.4 to 12.6% for men over the same period. Unpaid family work has actually declined. You'll see there's kind of a steep decline there around 2013. I think that's a weighting issue because the weights were changed in the survey. What I think is important here, that it's actually been fairly steady over the last 6 or 7 years, and is about 13.1% for men and 7.7% for women. When we look at the disaggregated measures, it becomes very clear that the majority of NEET youth in Thailand are actually inactive and not in education. And that is much higher for women than it is for men. And this is particularly true because a lot of women are not in the labor force because they are doing unpaid care work within the household. Another thing that I want to point out here in the gray is unemployment. And you can see that unemployment has actually increased for men. It's still, the share of youth that are unemployed is still not huge, but it is growing over time. Also, along with the marginally attached to the labor market. We see the same trend for women as well, but it's not quite as pronounced. When we stratify this by marital status, you'll see very, very, very clearly that most of the women who are NEET are, I should say, most of the women who are married and NEET are inactive and not in education. And there's some indications with some other questions in the labor force survey that they are basically at home taking care of children or taking care of elderly parents or grandparents. Whereas married men have very, very low NEET rates. They are kind of taking on the role of the breadwinner. We don't see much difference, though, in NEET rates between unmarried men and women, and I think that's quite important. I also want to take a look at education. And so on the top, we have education at lower levels. So this is basically compulsory education or lower. And we can see NEET rates are actually quite relatively low, both for men and women in that group. But if we look at those who have university education or higher, we find that the NEET rates are actually very high. In fact, it hit about 40% in 2020 for men. And that is driven very much so by unemployment, as well as marginal, we have much higher rates of marginal labor market attachment. And this seems to be an increasing trend over time. So this is the group that after sort of this descriptive exploration, this is the group that's really kind of jumping out and saying there's an issue here. And then finally, just want to look at urban-rural differences. Urban men and women don't look that different from each other, but we do see differences for rural men and women. Rural women are much more likely to be inactive and not in education. So I want to just talk about the COVID-19 crisis and the impacts on NEET status for youth in Thailand. In Thailand, we had a series of lockdowns. We had a very strict lockdown between March and May 2020. We had a softer lockdown that lasted for most of 2021. And this negatively impacted particularly service-based businesses. We also had closed international borders and then sort of slightly open borders with very long quarantine periods, which basically devastated our tourism market like it did around much of the world. And this, of course, impacted any tourism related industries, and again, a lot of service sector businesses as well. Thai youth are disproportionately represented in the service sector, and just in general, previous research around the world has said that youth are disproportionately impacted by economic downturns, and so this is why I wanted to look at the impact of COVID-19 on youth. So I'm only concentrating on 4 years of data. So I define a pre-COVID period, which is the third quarter of 2018 and 2019. And then the post-COVID period is the third quarter of 2020, which was just after the hard lockdown. And then in third quarter of 2021, when we were still sort of in this soft lockdown phase. So I just do a very simple test of proportional differences on the disaggregated NEET measures to see if there were shifts in those NEET measures. And then I run some probit. So I do a probit analysis so that I can interact the COVID period with personal characteristics to try to pull out sort of what types of youth are being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And so this is maybe the most important slide here. We can see that for the aggregate NEET measure for men, it did go up between the pre-COVID and post-COVID periods, and the difference is about 1.4%, and this is statistically significant. So there's so it is significant, although I would have to say it's not like this huge shock that I was expecting in terms of the shifts. The change in the NEET rate is actually being driven by unemployment and marginal labor market attachment. And so we're seeing more of that among male youth. Now, for women, it's a little bit different. You'll notice that the NEET rate doesn't change between the two periods. And I think this is very telling as to why it's important to really disaggregate these NEET measures, because it is capturing so many different things. And what we find, though, is that the inactive and not in education group actually went down. And my suspicion is because as people were kind of suffering because of the COVID crisis, that more people were needing to go and look for work. And in fact, we see this increase in unemployment as well as marginal labor market attachment. And so some other tests I've done has actually suggested that there was sort of moving out of this inactive status and into the labor market, and sometimes not being so successful in finding work. These numbers are small, so I'm summarizing what I found. So if we look at the outcome of inactive and not in education, in general, married women are more likely to be inactive and not in education. Also, the university educated are most likely to be in this category. In the COVID-19 crisis, there wasn't really a change for men in this particular status. But we did see this status decline for married women. So they are very likely to be inactive in education, but then in the crisis, it seems that, again, they're moving back into the labor force, probably to help support families financially. In terms of unemployment, we find the highest rates of unemployment among the highly educated. There's no change in unemployment for the women, but was reduced for household heads. Again, I think this was economic pressure leading more people to enter the labor market. For marginal labor market attachment, we have post-secondary graduates. So this includes university graduates as well as like upper vocational graduates are much more likely to be marginally attached to the labor market than people with lower levels of education. Male university graduates, have higher marginal labor market attachment, and there didn't seem to be much change for women once we've controlled for personal characteristics. And then finally, the unpaid family worker status. Again, postgraduates are the most likely to be, or more likely than those with lower education to be in unpaid family work, potentially working for family businesses and helping to support the family that way. Married workers and workers in rural agricultural areas are also more likely to be unpaid family workers. And there wasn't a huge change during COVID-19, although it looks like there was an increase in highly educated women moving into unpaid family work. And so I've basically given you just an overview of what I found in the data. So I'm not really saying much about policy. It's just kind of bringing up maybe more questions than answers. So in general, what do we find? NEET has been rising over time. The COVID-19 crisis didn't we see a little bit more, but we also had a trend beforehand. So the COVID-19 crisis may have exacerbated the trend beforehand, but it's not sort of causing a NEET in Thailand. The disaggregated measures indicate that women are more likely to be inactive and not in education, and they are generally engaged in care work. I didn't show those results, but that's basically this group of what this group of women is doing. University graduates, particularly men, are the ones with the highest shares of unemployment and marginal labor market attachment. And with COVID-19, we saw overall the NEET rate for men went up, and that was driven by unemployment and marginal labor market attachment. For women, there's no change in the actual NEET rate. However, when we look inside, we see women leaving this inactive state and going into the labor market. So we do see increases in the shares that are unemployed and marginally attached to the labor market. So overall changes in NEET are modest during the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, the big question is why, and this needs a lot of further exploration. One thing I think is really crucial is to look at the role of the informal market. I know I've talked about this with Jayati a lot in the past, is that the informal market in Thailand is always used as this buffer. And this is part of the reason why our overall unemployment rates are so low. And so there's probably a lot of movement within, in and out of formal and informal work, or different types of informal work. But unfortunately, we don't have longitudinal data to be able to track individuals to see exactly what's going on. We just get these yearly or quarterly snapshots. And then also the nature of marginal labor market attachment. I mean, what does this look like? Because university graduates are coming from households that are generally wealthier. And so is it that they're really discouraged workers, or is it that they're kind of sitting back and kind of waiting for that right opportunity, or just taking an opportunity to take a break? And there is some indication even in this data that a lot of them are just taking a break and waiting for the labor market to get better. So this is not necessarily a problem to solve necessarily, but we do need to think about what's happening with the university graduates. And I do a lot of other work on labor market mismatch and so on. And we also see increasing mismatch in the labor market between degrees and jobs. And then also, so anyway, there's a lot of other issues I think that need to be taken a look at, but at least this gives us an overview statistically about what's going on. Thank you.